Treasure Island, Chapter 27, Pieces of Eight. Owing to the cant of the vessel, the mast hung far out over the water, and from my perch on the cross trees I had nothing below me but the surface of the bay. Hans, who was not so far up, was in consequence nearer to the ship, and fell between me and the bulwarks. He rose once to the surface in a lather of foam and blood, and then sank again for good. As the waters settled, I could see him lying huddled together on the clean, bright sand in the shadow of the vessel's side. A fish or two whipped past his body. Sometimes by the quivering of the water he appeared to move a little, as if he were trying to rise, but he was dead enough for all that, being both shot and drowned, and was food for the fish in the very place where he designed my slaughter. I was no sooner certain of this than I began to feel sick, faint, and terrified. The hot blood was running over my back and chest. The dirk where it had pinned my shoulder to the mast seemed to burn like a hot iron. Yet it was not so much these real sufferings that distressed me. For these, it seemed to me, I could bear without a murmur. It was the horror I had upon my mind of falling from the cross trees into that still green water beside the body of the coxswain. I clung with both hands till my nails ached, and I shut my eyes as if to cover the peril. Gradually my mind came back again, my pulses quieted down to a more natural time, and I was once more in possession of myself. It was my first thought to pluck forth the dirk, but it either stuck too hard or my nerve failed me, and I desisted with a violent shudder. Oddly enough, that very shudder did the business. The knife, in fact, had come the nearest in the world to missing me altogether. It held me there by a mere pinch of skin, and this shudder tore it away. The blood ran down faster, to be sure, but I was my own master again, and only tacked to the mast by my coat and shirt. These last I broke through with a sudden jerk, and then regained my deck by the starboard shrouds. For nothing in the world I would have again ventured, shaken as I was, upon the overhanging port shrouds, from which Israel had so lately fallen. I went below and did what I could for my wound. It pained me a good deal, and still bled freely, but was neither deep nor dangerous, nor did it greatly gall me when I used my arm. Then I looked around me, and the ship was now, in a sense, my own. I began to think of clearing it from its last passenger, the dead man, O'Brien. He had pitched, as I said, against the bulwarks, where he lay like some horrible, ungainly sort of puppet. Life-sized, indeed, but how different from the life's color or life's comeliness. In that position I could easily have my way with him, as the habit of tragical adventures had worn off almost all terror for the dead. I took him by the waist as if he had been a sack of bran, and with one good heave tumbled him overboard. He went in with the sounding plunge. The red cap came off and remained floating on the surface, and as soon as the splash subsided I could see him and Israel lying side by side, both wavering the tremulous movement of the water. O'Brien, though still quite a young man, was very bald. There he lay with that bald head across the knees of the man who had killed him, and the quick fishes steering to and fro over both. I was now alone upon the ship, and the tide had just turned. The sun was within a few degrees of setting, but already a shadow of the pines upon the western shore began to reach right across the anchorage and fall in patterns on the deck. The evening breeze had sprung up, and though it was well warded off by the hill, with the two peaks upon the east, the cordage had begun to sing a little softly to itself, the idle sails to rattle to and fro. I began to see a danger to the ship. The jibs I speedily doused and brought tumbling to the deck, but the mainsail was a harder matter. Of course, when the schooner canted over, the boom had swung outboard, and the cap of it and a foot or two of sail hung even under the water. Though I thought this made it still more dangerous, yet the strain was so heavy that I half feared to meddle. At last I got my knife and cut the halyards. The peak dropped instantly. A great belly of loose canvas floated broad upon the water, and since, pull as I liked, I could not budge the downhaul, that was the extent of what I could accomplish. For the rest, the Hispaniola must trust to luck itself. By this time the whole anchorage had fallen into shadow, the last rays, I remember, falling through the glade of the wood, and shining bright as jewels on the flowery mantle of the wreck. It began to chill, the tide was rapidly fleeting seaward, the schooner settling more and more on her beam ends. I scrambled forward and looked over. It seemed shallow enough, and holding the cut hawser in both hands for a last safety, I let myself drop softly overboard. The water scarcely reached my waist, the sand was firm and covered with the ripple marks, and I waded ashore in great spirits, leaving the Hispaniola on her side, with her mainsail trailing wide upon the surface of the bay. About the same time, the sun went fairly down, and the breeze whistled low in the dusk among the tossed pines. At least and at last I was off the sea, nor had I returned thence empty-handed. There lay the schooner, clear at last from buccaneers, and ready for our own men to board again and get to sea again. I had nothing nearer my fancy than to get home to the stockade and boast of my achievements. Possibly I might be blamed a bit for my truancy, but the recapture of the Hispaniola was a clenching answer, and I hoped that even Captain Smollett would confess that I had not lost my time. So thinking and in famous spirits, I began to set my face homeward for the blockhouse and my companions. I remembered the most easterly of the rivers which drain into Captain Kidd's anchorage ran from the two-peaked hill upon the left, and I bent my course in that direction, that I might pass the stream while it was small. The wood was pretty open and keeping low among the lower spurs. I had turned the corner of that hill, and was not long after wading to the mid-calf across the watercourse. This brought me near to where I encountered Ben Gunn, the maroon, and I walked more circumspectly, keeping an eye on every side. The dusk had come nigh completely, and as I opened out the cleft between the two peaks, I became aware of the wavering glow against the sky, where, as I judged, the man of the island was cooking his supper before a roaring fire. And yet I wondered in my heart if he should show himself so careless. For if I could see his radiance, might it not reach the eyes of Silver himself where he camped upon the shore marshes? Gradually the night fell blacker, and it was all I could do to guide myself, even roughly, toward my destination. The double hill behind me and the spyglass on my right loomed fainter and fainter. The stars were few and pale, and in the low ground where I wandered, I kept tripping among bushes and rolling into sandy pits. Suddenly a kind of brightness fell about me. I looked up, and a pale glimmer of moonbeams had alighted on the summit of the spyglass. And after I saw something broad and silvery moving low and down behind the trees, and knew the moon had risen. With this to help me, I passed rapidly over what remained to me of my journey, and sometimes walking, sometimes running, impatiently drew near to the stockade. Yet as I began to thread the grove that lies before it, I was not so thoughtless that I slacked my pace and went a trifle warily. It would have been a poor end of my adventure to get shot down by my own party in mistake. The moon was climbing higher and higher. Its light began to fall here and there in masses through the more open districts of the wood, and right in front of me the glow of a different color appeared among the trees. It was red and hot. Now and again it was a little darkened, as it were, the embers of a bonfire smoldering. For the life of me I could not think what it might be. At last I came right down to the border of the clearing. The western end was already steeped in moonshine. The rest, and the blockhouse itself, still lay in black shadow, checkered with long silvery streaks of light. On either side of the house an immense fire had burned itself into clear embers, and shed a steady red reverberation, contrasted strongly with the mellow paleness of the moon. There was not a soul stirring, nor a sound beside the noises of the breeze. I stopped with much wonder in my heart, and perhaps a little terror also. It had not been our way to build great fires. We were, indeed, by the captain's orders, somewhat niggardly of firewood, and I began to fear that something had gone wrong while I was absent. I stole round by the eastern end, keeping close shadow, and at the convenient place where the darkness was thickest crossed the palisade. To make my assurance sure, I got on my hands and knees and crawled without a sound to the corner of the house. As I drew nearer, my heart was suddenly and greatly lightened. It was not a pleasant noise in itself. I have often complained of it at other times, but just then it was like music to hear my friends snoring together so loud and peacefully in their sleep. The sea cry of the watch, that all's well, never more reassuringly on my ear. In the meantime there was no doubt of one thing. They kept an infamous bad watch. If it had been Silver and his lads that were now creeping on them, not a soul would have seen daybreak. That was what it was, thought I, to have the captain wounded, and again I blamed myself sharply for leaving them in danger with so few to mount a guard. By this time I got to the door and stood up. All was dark within, so that I could distinguish nothing by eye. As for sounds, there was a steady drone of snores and a small occasional noise, a flickering or pecking that I in no way could account for. With my arms before me I walked steadily in. I should lie down in my own place, I thought with a silent chuckle, and enjoy their faces when they found me in the morning. My foot struck something yielding. It was a sleeper's leg. He turned and groaned, but without awakening. And then, all of a sudden, a shrill voice broke forth in the darkness. Pieces of 8, 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 and so forth, without pause or change, like the clacking of a tiny mill. Silver's green parrot, Captain Flint. It was she whom I heard pecking at a piece of bark. It was she, keeping better watch than any human being, who thus announced my arrival with her wearisome refrain. I had no time left me to recover. At the sharp clipping tone of the parrot, the sleepers awoke and sprang up with a mighty oath and the cry of Silver, "Who goes?" I turned to run, struck violently against one person, recoiled, and ran full into the arms of a second, who for his part closed upon and held me tight. "Bring a torch, Dick," said Silver, with my capture thus assured. And one of the men left the log house and presently returned with a lighted brand. This is the end of chapter 27, and this is the end of part 5. So, Jim made it back to the palisade and saw the remains of a big bonfire. He's like, the captain wouldn't let us do big bonfires. That was strange. There was no guard. That was strange. Jim was like, I'll sneak in, I'll just take my place. And then he stumbled over somebody. And then he heard the parrot. And the parrot ratted him out. So Jim was just blundering right into this because, here he is. He's going to... Well, right now he's in the hands of Silver and what's left of Silver's men. I imagine Silver's not too happy with the disappearance of the ship, and who knows what happened to the doctor and the squire and the captain. The squire or the doctor is probably safe because he went out to find Ben Gunn, but where's everybody else? I mean, this is scary. We shall find out.